Hey there, hi there, ho there. We're back again. And this is, Chapter 6 of Let the Circle Be Unbroken. Last time we talked about the AAA or the Farm Workers Union. That was the topic of discussion for the last chapter. So, let's see. Oh, yes. And little Miss JC was meeting up with a white boy. And they got separated by Uncle Hammer. So here we go. Chapter 6, Let the Circle Be Unbroken. On Sunday morning, Uncle Hammer, neat and dapper as always in a brown serge suit, backed the car out of the barn. All the red mud which had gathered around its fender and splotched its yellow body was gone, for Uncle Hammer and the boys and I had washed it after our return from the Wigginses. One thing Uncle Hammer couldn't abide was a dirty car. He had worked silently, his anger still bottled inside, but by supper time his mood had softened. And this morning, as we prepared for church, he was once again laughing and warm. As he had done yesterday, he handed Papa the keys and told him to drive. All of us, except Mr. Morrison, who was not a church-going man, piled into the car. Papa started the engine and we swept down the drive into the road. At church, Papa parked the Ford next to Mr. Wellever's Model A, the only other car amidst the battered farm wagons. As always, Uncle Hammer was greeted enthusiastically, for he was one of the few people who had ever ventured north from the community, and, in the eyes of the people at Great Faith, had made quite a success of his move. The fact that he had arrived walking only a few months before had not dented people's conviction that he was doing well up in Chicago. For hadn't he come down in a car just like Harlan Granger's just a year ago? It didn't matter that he had to give it up. After all, everybody had hard times. It didn't matter either that the Ford was 10 years older than the Packard. It was better than anything they had ever had, and Uncle Hammer's supposed prosperity somehow reflected on them. A small crowd had gathered when we arrived, but Big Ma soon broke it up, shooing us inside as the bell began to ring for Sunday school. An hour later, when Sunday school was over and everyone escaped for the half-hour break before service, the crowd began to form again. The boys and I squeezed in among the men, finding their gathering more interesting than our own friends this morning. "Didn't I tell you, Paige? Didn't I tell you?" said Mr. Tom B. "When old Hammer come walking down that road, that big meeting? I said he ain't gonna be walking long. No, sir. There was some folks said once you sold that Packard, most likely you wasn't gonna get another one. And here you come in this fine yellow thing," he exclaimed with admiration, choosing to ignore in his enthusiasm the car's age. "I always did fancy yellow." "Yeah, it's nice, all right," put in Mr. Silas Lanier. "But y'all remember last year when Hammer come home in that big old fine Packard like Mr. Granger's? Now, ain't nothing gonna ever be fine as that." "'Member it!" cried Mr. Tom B. "'Member it! Oh, Lord have mercy, that thing sure did me good. Old Harlan Granger was about fit to be tied when he seed old Hammer with that car." He chuckled with satisfaction. "Says to me, says, 'Tom, how you reckon Hammer come by a car like that?' And I says, 'Oh, I surely don't know, Mr. Granger, but ain't it fine?'" Again Mr. Tom B. laughed heartily, exposing his toothless gums. "Ow-wee! There, that thing done me so much good. Sure did. Well, I likes this one, said Joe, who had been standing a little outside the circle, admiring the car. Boy, what you know about what you like and don't like? Questioned Mr. Page Ellis. You know about as much as cars as I do about white folks. Politicking. Okay, let me say that again. Make it a little bit smaller. Boy, what you know about what you like and don't like? Questioned Mr. Page Ellis. You know about as much about cars as I do about white folks politicking. Nothing. I knows what I like, contended Joe, as all the men except Papa and Uncle Hammer laughed at his childlike defense. Papa, who was standing nearest Joe, asked, How come you like it, Joe? The laughter died as the men noted Papa's seriousness. I likes the color, Joe spoke up. I likes yellow. One of these here days, I'm going to get me a car and go on up north and visit Hammer. That be all right, Hammer? That be fine, Joe. Mr. Page Ellis snorted his disbelief. Well, I is going to get me one just like Hammer. You like this car better than that one I had last year? Uncle Hammer asked. That one with all that gray and pretty insides and looking like Mr. Granger's? Joe spurted out excitedly. Uncle Hammer nodded. That's right, I didn't have it long. No, sure didn't, Joe agreed. Then after a moment's pause he added, But you had it long enough. Uncle Hammer smiled in appreciation of Joe's frankness. It was so nice, all right, but this here, it's better, 'cause that one minded me of it raining all the time. This here, it minds me of sunshine. Joe timidly put out his hand and ran his calloused fingers gingerly along the car's hood. I sure wish I could take me a ride. Boy, get your hands off Hammer's car before you get it dirty, ordered Mr. Ellis. My hands ain't dirty. They're clean as yours. Papa put a hand on Joe's shoulder, quieting him, and glanced at Uncle Hammer. It all right with you if I take Joe for a short ride? There's time yet for church. Uncle Hammer nodded. Go ahead. You mean it? You mean it? Joe gushed. Gonna get me a ride in Hammer's car. Excitedly and with a triumphant look at Mr. Ellis, who had ridden in neither the Packard nor the Ford, he climbed into the front seat. David, said Mr. Silas Lanier, before you go, there's something I want to find out. Any Union men come by your place yesterday? A. Morris Wheeler and a John Moses? Mr. Lanier nodded. Said they had. Thought I'd check. What you think? About the Union? Papa took a moment as the men waited. Well, if I was a sharecropper man, I might consider it. What they had to say made sense. Only thing is here business of unionizing with white folks. I don't much trust that. Well, I sure don't trust it, said Mr. Wiggins, Little Willie's father. The Wigginses, like us, own their own place. Don't trust nothing white folks gonna be part of. Mr. Lanier agreed, but said, Thing is, though, I think he's telling the truth of it. We got us a better chance of getting something done round here. We all join in together. Well, I'll tell y'all, said Mr. Ellis. I just don't know what we gonna do. Mr. Granger don't let up on that government money. We planting less and getting less money, too. Aw, man, waiting for Mr. Granger to give us that money's like waiting for hell to freeze over, Mr. Lanier scoffed. Ain't that the truth, Mr. Tom B. agreed. Mr. Lanier rubbed his chin, then shook his head at the dismal prospects. Well, seemed like maybe the Union's best way to go, then. Leastways, see what them Union men got in mind to do. All the men were silent. Then Mr. Ellis said, We go joining unions around here, some head's gonna roll. Mr. Granger done already told me that. Said anybody joins can just get off his land. And once again, the men were silent. David, come on, Joe called from the car. Gonna have to ring that bell any minute now. David, you think it's all right? Mr. Ellis asked as Papa turned to the car. About the meeting? Papa met Mr. Ellis's eyes. What I think ain't as important as what you think. We ain't affected the same way. But you going to the meeting? Papa glanced over at Uncle Hammer, then back to Mr. Ellis. Most likely, he said, and got into the car. Little Man and Christopher John scrambled in for the ride, but Stacy and I remained with Uncle Hammer. For several minutes the men continued to talk of the Union, then of their crops, their families, and what life could hold for them in that far-off place called the North. Then Mr. Page Ellis said, Hammer, I imagine David done sure enough started something by taking that boy Joe for a ride, 'cause that's all he gonna be talking about from now on. Now, if he'd had a chance to ride in that Packard, Lord never would have heard the end of it, laughed Mr. Tom B. Seems to me like that Packard's all I'm hearing about as it is anyways. Just how you come to sell it? Payments get too high. Everyone in the circle looked around, searching for the man who had spoken. Our eyes settled on a heavy-set, dark-skinned stranger standing a little outside the circle. The man was smiling at Uncle Hammer. The rest of us looked curiously from the man to Uncle Hammer, for no one who knew Uncle Hammer would have dared ask him such a question. Uncle Hammer studied the man. Finally he said, I know you. Name's Jake Willis, said the stranger with a broadening grin that revealed 2 gold teeth. Come down visiting with my friend Jesse Randall here and his folks. He gestured toward a short, thin man standing behind him. I knew the man. He was the son of Mr. and Mrs. Moss Randall, who lived over near Smellings Creek. Mr. Jesse Randall looked a bit uneasy as Jake Willis continued to talk. Course, I know who you are, he said. Should. All I've been hearing about since I got to church this morning is Hammer Logan. The grin was still on his face, but there was something in his tone which made me uncomfortable. You from around these here parts? Uncle Hammer asked, not returning his smile. I know most folks as far as Strawberry. No, sir. As a matter of fact, I just come from Jackson a couple of weeks back. Heard they was getting ready to set up some government jobs down here. Thought I'd be here waiting for 'em when they come. Uncle Hammer nodded, his eyes steady on the man, and Jake Willis went on. I'm sure hoping I can get one too. I hear tell the government set aside some jobs for coloreds so's the white folks don't take 'em all. He laughed. Course now I know even if I do get lucky and get me a job, I know I ain't gonna near about be making no kind of money to go and buy me no Packard. Jake, interrupted Mr. Randall, looking haplessly from Uncle Hammer to his friend, trying to stop him. Jake, like some folks. Jake, I think most niggers I know can't get them no kind of car at all, let alone no Packard. White folks can't hardly buy nothing neither. Just wondering how come you so lucky. Stacy and I looked at each other and then back to Uncle Hammer, who after a solemn appraisal of Mr. Willis said, Look, Mr. Willis, ain't had nothing to do with it. Mr. Page Ellis cleared his throat and Mr. Tom B. looked uneasily toward the church. Wonder how come that boy ain't rung that bell yet, he mumbled, seeming to forget that Joe was out riding with Papa. Jake, we better join Grandpa in church, Mr. Randall said. Bell's gonna ring any minute now. Jake Willis waited a moment before agreeing, then, with sudden consternation, looked around the circle. Hey, I sure hope I ain't said nothing out of place or anything. I sure didn't mean no offense. The Ford came onto the church grounds and the men gratefully turned their attention to its arrival. Hey, Hammer, that's one fine car, all right, hollered Joe, jumping out. Sure is, one fine car. Gots to ring that bell now. With that, he dashed for the belfry, and the men began to disperse. Come on, Cassie, Stacy, Papa called as Uncle Hammer joined him. Christopher John and Little Man on the other side of the car. We better get on into the church. Stacy and I followed them, passing Mr. Jesse Randall and Jake Willis. As we passed, Mr. Randall said, You ain't from round here, so you don't know, but man, don't you go messing with Hammer Logan. That nigger's crazy. Jake Willis glanced over at Uncle Hammer, who had by now reached the church steps. The lips pulled back over the gold teeth, and he grinned widely. You don't say, was all he said. Reverend Gabson was in splendid form. I listened attentively for his first hour as he recounted the birth of the baby Jesus, my favorite sermon, and his too, for it mattered not to him what time of year he preached it, but then when the wise men and the shepherds had paid their visit, and Mary and Joseph and the baby had fled into Egypt, my attention began to wane. Reverend Gabson began to expound on the theory that too many of us were like King Herod, suspicious and jealous of someone who wasn't even thinking about us, and that we should be loving our neighbors instead of sitting around worrying about what they were doing. I knew that now he had hit on the real meat of his sermon. He would preach on for another good hour. Unfortunately, because he preached here only every other Sunday, dividing his time between Great Faith and New Hope in Strawberry, he seemed to think he would be remiss in dismissing the congregation after only 1 hour. At least in winter, his long sermons were easier to take. In the heat and sweat of summer, the long hours in the small church were hell itself. Now, as he droned on, I attempted to fight off the drowsiness which was quickly slipping over me. I pinched myself. I bit my lips. I even went so far as to dig my nails into my arms. Nothing helped. Reverend Gabson's sermons were just made for sleeping. Big Ma woke me with a sharp nudge, and after a disapproving glance leaned over and shook Christopher John, sitting beside me snoring blissfully. At her touch he awoke, looked around shamefaced, then folded his plump hands and gazed with great earnestness at Reverend Gabson. Little Man, sitting between Mama and Papa, was wide awake, his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on a spider crawling up the pew in front of us. Stacy, who never fell asleep in church, sat beside Uncle Hammer, paying strict attention, like the adult person he thought he was. With Big Ma's attention once again on the preacher, I looked around the church. Half the children were dozing. At the back of the church sat Jake Willis with the Randall family. He wasn't smiling now. His eyes were directed on Reverend Gabson, but there was something in his look that made me think he was paying less attention to the sermon than I. Girl, turn round, Big Ma said. I started to obey, then noticed another stranger. He was sitting in the very last pew 2 rows behind the Randalls. He wasn't from around here. I knew that, and I couldn't remember ever having seen him before. Yet there was something about the square-jawed cut of his face that seemed very familiar. Cassie! I turned quickly and went back to the business of trying to stay awake. By the time Reverend Gabson opened the doors of the church and welcomed all visitors to stand, the stranger was gone. But when we were finally dismissing and left the church, I spied him standing beside a car parked near Uncle Hammer's. He watched as the people came out, then, seeming to recognize someone, pushed his way through the crowd. He stood outside the small group which had gathered to say hello to Uncle Hammer. I thought that perhaps he knew Uncle Hammer, too, and was waiting to speak to him, but then he said, Mary Louise, how'd you like to turn around and take a look at a genuine grown Delta boy? I looked from the man to Mama, who was turning in surprise. She stood for a moment stunned, then ventured quizzically, Buddy? Buddy, is that you? Who else? Said the man, laughing. Bud! Oh, good Lord, Bud! I don't believe it, David! Mama tugged excitedly at Papa, whose back was to her. David, this is Bud! And with that, she threw her arms around the man and began to both cry and laugh at once. "Who's Bud?" I whispered to Stacy. Stacy stared at the man. "The way Mama's carrying on, I suppose he must be some kind of kin or something." "So this is Bud," Papa said, shaking the man's hand when Mama let him go. "And you're David." "Sure have heard enough about you," Papa laughed. "And I bet wasn't none of it good." "Now I wouldn't say that," Papa protested. "Lord, look at you," Mama said with a shake of her head, as if unable to believe that the man was actually there. "You sure are a sight for sore eyes. Mama, you remember me talking about my sister Lottie's boy?" "Now, how you think I'm going to forget something like that?" demanded Big Ma. "Come here, boy, and give me a hug. You one of mine, too." The man laughed as he embraced Big Ma. Then Mama introduced him to Uncle Hammer and the boys and me. He was Cousin Bud Rankin. Now I knew why he had seemed so familiar. His picture hung on the wall above Mama's roll-top desk. Cousin Bud was introduced to the others standing near. Then as people began to head for home and Sunday supper, Big Ma asked him how he knew where we were. "Well, I managed to find my way to your place, and there was this man there." "Mr. Morrison," said Big Ma. "Yes'm." "Huge fella. Well, he told me y'all was here, and I come on down." It was decided that Mama would ride back with Cousin Bud. Little Man and Christopher John chose to go with them as well. The rest of us climbed into Uncle Hammer's car. Papa pulled out first, followed by Cousin Bud. As I glanced back at Cousin Bud's car, I noticed Jake Willis standing off to the side, staring after us. Despite what Reverend Gabson had said about being suspicious about folks, I found myself wondering about Jake Willis. I couldn't help it. I just didn't like the looks of that man. Cousin Bud was a handsome man with a winsome smile and a pleasant way about him. He was Mama's nephew, even though he was 3 years older than Mama. The son of Mama's older sister, Cousin Bud had grown up with Mama and had been like a brother to her. Throughout dinner, the two talked practically non-stop, laughing and joking, reminiscing about their childhood, and when dinner was over, we all sat in front of the fire. They began telling their storytelling in earnest. Soon all the adults joined in, telling stories of long ago, stories about themselves, about people the boys and I knew well, and about people whom we would never know except through stories. We laughed a lot, remembered a lot, and enjoyed the day. Then as night came and the hour grew late, Mama asked Cousin Bud to sing. He hesitated at first, saying he hadn't sung for quite a while. But when Mama insisted, the music slipped from him like water from a well, rising in sweet, smooth sounds to our ears. He sang several festive songs I hadn't heard before, followed by several more songs in which we all joined. Then, at Big Ma's request, he sang, "Lord God Almighty, stand by me. Lord God Almighty, stand by me. There'll be a time when trouble comes. There'll be a time when I'm all alone. There'll be a time when no one's near, none of my family, no one dear. There'll be a time when I'm sick and frail, treated like dirt and thrown in jail. There'll be a time when I'm deep in despair, lost all hope, no longer care. And I ask myself, how can I go on? Lord God Almighty, stand by me." When Cousin Bud finished, no one stirred. He had sung the words with such depth, such feeling that we were all awed to silence. Finally, Big Ma wiped her eyes and thanked him. My Pa Edward loved that song, sure did. I thanks you for it. Mama smiled proudly at Cousin Bud. You still got it, Bud. That voice'll charm anybody. Don't I wish, Cousin Bud laughed. It's mighty fine, all right, Papa said. Mighty fine. Used to get him into a whole lot of trouble, too, that voice of his, Mama said. Once he got to courting age, every time I turned around he was busy wooing some girl, singing to her. And wouldn't just be wooing one or two, but more like 5 or 6 at a time. Then when the girls would find out about each other, they'd get mad at him and me, too. They figured I knew all about the others and should have told them. Some of them even wanted to fight about the thing. Me, not him. But you always won, laughed Cousin Bud. Little man looked up surprised. Mama, you used to fight? She ain't told you? Exclaimed Cousin Bud. Well, look right here. He pointed to a thin line running from his hairline down his forehead into his eyebrow. That there was put on me by your mama when she was about 8 years old. Took the biggest stick she could lay her little hands on and hauled off and hit me with it. Mama smiled girlishly. Well, you made me mad. All of us laughed. Sure did do it, chuckled Uncle Cousin Bud. Remembering, he fixed his eyes on the boys and me. Let me tell y'all, there ain't nothing in this world worse than having a sassy aunt younger than you are. When she couldn't have her way, she'd say, but I'm your aunt, and you have to do what I say. Then I'd say, that ain't nothing, I'm older and bigger too. Then we'd get to it. And we both end up with a whipping, interjected Mama. Sister Lottie or Papa would wear us out. Sure would, agreed Cousin Bud. Then the smile left his face. You been home since Mama died? Mama shook her head. Not since Papa passed. With him and Sister Lottie both gone, I didn't much want to go back. Cousin Bud nodded, indicating he felt the same. Ain't wanted to go back myself. Fact is, this is my first trip back down here since Mama died. Uncle Hammer got up and put another log on the fire. Just what brings you back now, Bud? Well, my wife, she's visiting here. She's here? Mama questioned. Well, why didn't you bring her with you? Suddenly, Cousin Bud looked uneasy. Well, she just wanted to come see her folks this trip. She come before me and went on down to Macomb. I come to get her. I thought you married a northern girl. Cousin Bud fidgeted in his chair. Did, but we didn't stay together. Oh, I didn't know. You never wrote me that. Things just didn't work out. Things happen that way sometime. Me and Lydia, that's my wife now, we got married a few years after I got to New York. Got us a daughter, 15, named Susella. I told you in my letters. You didn't tell me much else, Mama teased. Then she smiled, pleased for him. Well, I sure would like to meet Lydia. Susella, too. Try to get Lydia to come back this way, will you? Cousin Bud turned to Mama, his look strange. Then he shook his head. Mary, I gotta tell you something. Mama looked at him in silence, her head tilted, waiting. Of course, you ain't gonna want to hear it. What is it, Bud? He rubbed his hands together nervously and stared into the fire. Mama reached toward him. Bud? He turned suddenly to face her. She's white, Mary. Lydia, my wife, I married a white woman. She left me, and I come to get her back. Mama's reach stopped in midair. Cousin Bud looked slowly around the room. No one spoke. I knew that by his words Cousin Bud had separated himself from the rest of us. From their faces I could tell that the boys knew it too, for white people were part of another world, distant strangers who ruled our lives and were better left alone. When they entered our lives, they were to be treated courteously, but with aloofness, and sent away as quickly as possible. Besides, for a black man to even look at a white woman was dangerous. A year and a half ago, Mr. John Henry Berry had been burned to death, killed for supposedly flirting with a white woman, and his uncle, Mr. Samuel Berry, who tried to defend him and his brother, had lain like a charred log until he had died a few months ago. A white woman was foreign, dangerous, and here Cousin Bud had gone off and married one. Cousin Bud shrugged and smiled somewhat lopsidedly. I told you you wouldn't want to hear it. Again there was silence. Then Uncle Hammer slowly stood, his chair scraping noisily against the wood floor. He stared down at Cousin Bud. "You're a fool," he said. "Hammer?" Big Ma protested. "Coming down here running after some confounded white woman." "Hammer, Bud's nearest kin," Papa said quietly. "Leave it be." Uncle Hammer's eyes met Papa's, then glanced again at Cousin Bud, who looked away, not saying anything at all. Uncle Hammer kept his eyes on him a moment longer, his look contemptuous, then crossed to the side door and went out. "Children, I think you'd best go to bed now," Mama said. Mr. Morrison stood. "Guess I'd better turn in myself." He left, and the boys and I went off to our rooms. Soon after, I had Papa go outside to join Uncle Hammer, and right after that, Big Ma came into bed. Mama was left to talk to Cousin Bud alone. "How you s'pose he could have done it?" I asked Stacy the next morning as we did our morning chores. "How you s'pose he could have gone off and married a white woman?" "Maybe he loved her," suggested Christopher John. Stacy whirled around. "Boy, you get that out of your head right now. Can't love anybody white, and don't you never try. That man's just a fool, like Uncle Hammer said." Christopher John, startled by Stacy's attack, dropped one of the eggs he held. He looked down at the broken egg, then back up at Stacy, his eyes growing big. Christopher John did not like to rouse anyone's anger, and especially not Stacy's. Both he and Little Man idolized Stacy, and to incur his anger was a hurting thing. I didn't mean nothing," he mumbled weakly. "I just thought—" His voice trailed off. "You better clean that up," I said when Stacy, without a word of consolation, only glanced at the egg and continued milking the cow Nadine. Obediently, Christopher John carefully put the good egg he still had into the egg basket, and taking the shovel, scooped up the broken egg and took it off to the hog slop. When he returned, he went quietly back to work, but Little Man said, "One thing I know, Uncle Hammer's sure enough's mad. He's so mad Papa told him to just hush." I looked up. "When'd he tell him that?" "On the back porch when they was washing up this morning. Papa said he's Mary's kin and you gotta respect that." "What Uncle Hammer say?" "Said ain't gotta respect no fool." "What Papa say to that?" "Said then respect Mary." Then Uncle Hammer he nodded and didn't say nothing else. I turned to Stacy. "What do you think? You think there'll be trouble between Uncle Hammer and Cousin Bud?" Stacy continued to melt. "What I think is Cousin Bud best stay out of Uncle Hammer's way, or—" He reached for another bucket and didn't finish. "Or what?" He turned slightly to look at me. "Or leave. Now that's what he ought to do. He oughtn't to have come here in the first place." "Maybe he shouldn't have come, but Cousin Bud was here now, and Mama tried to make him feel welcome. At breakfast she talked with him about old times, and nothing was said about last night. Papa, Big Ma, Mr. Morrison all joined the talk, but Uncle Hammer said nothing at all. And despite the constant chatter, his silence made the breakfast tense, and I for one was glad when it was over. After breakfast, while Little Man and I did the dishes, Cousin Bud remained sipping one last cup of coffee and talking with Mama. Little Man and I worked quietly, listening with avid curiosity. You know, Mary, maybe it'd be better if I went on and left today. I thought you were planning on staying until Wednesday. Was, but you know Hammer don't like me being here. Don't you mind Hammer? I understand why he feels about me like he do. That's why I'd better get on out of here. Mama sighed. It's been so long, Bud. Wait at least until tomorrow. All right, you think it'll be all right? He laughed softly, but the sound was sad. I guess I'll never quite get over it, how people take the news I'm married to a white woman. Lord, I get to feeling so guilty about it, like I stuck a knife in somebody or something. Lydia, she feels the same. That's why she's gone. Just couldn't take it any longer. But who'd we ever hurt besides maybe ourselves and our little girl? He was silent a moment. Mama didn't speak. You know, Mary, it ain't all that awful being married to somebody white. I mean, it's awful 'cause of what folks say and think and what some folks will do. But when it comes right down to it, they're just folks like us. No, Bud, not like us. Mary, you've always been reasonable. Most times Lydia's just a woman to me. She ain't got no color at all. And she's a lovely woman, a good woman. It's just that this thing's been as hard on her as it's been on me. Don't expect me to understand about you and this woman, Mama said testily. Just don't expect me to understand. Well, what'd I do that was so wrong? Marry a woman I love, that's all. It was an angry, frustrated outburst. Mama did not respond to it. And I did love her, Mary. I still do. What will you do when you find her, Bud? You don't really expect to just walk up to her in the street or march up to the front door of her family's house and tell her to come back. They'll lynch you before you've even got the words out. I'll think of a way. I just need to talk to her, that's all. I can talk to her. She'll come back. You said you have a daughter. What about her? Is she with Lydia? No, left her with some friends of mine. I heard him sigh. That's one thing I wanted to talk to you about. Mary, about my girl Susella. She's one of the main reasons I come through this way. It ain't easy on her being what she is. She could almost pass for white. No, that ain't so. She can pass. And I know she does it too. She can't when she's with me, but her mama encourages her. Says it'll make life easier for her. Cousin Bud cleared his throat and waited a moment before going on. What's worse is that Suzella's ashamed of me. Mary. Oh, she loves me all right. It's just that I can feel the shame. Still, I can't fault her for it. The child just don't know where she belongs. And most times I think she believes she don't belong no place. She said stays to herself and ain't got no friends much, excepting maybe at that school she go to. Her mother's got her in a Catholic school outside the neighborhood. I get the feeling sometime that Susella, she don't much want anything to do with the colored young'uns. The colored anything. He paused as if waiting for Mama to say something. After a moment she obliged him. Well, I guess that's to be expected. Mary, I want her to accept being who she is. She's colored and she's got to accept that. I may be married to a white woman, but that don't mean I'm trying to be white. Suzella's a colored girl because her daddy's a colored man. And no matter how much she might wish she ain't, I ain't. We both stuck with what we are, and I don't want her wishing otherwise. I don't want her passing. He took a moment and then said, Mary, I got to ask you something. What, Bud? Well, I know it might be hard on you, but I was thinking I'd like to send Susella down here a while to stay with you. Little Man and I shot surprised glances at each other. You be good for her, Mary. You and David, your whole family. You're close, and she needs that. It'd give her a chance for a real family, more than me and Lydia being able to give her. What about Lydia? Cousin Bud sighed heavily. She loves Susella. I don't think she'll be able to stay away from her if I can just talk some sense into it. What if she doesn't want Susella staying with us? Don't matter. This is one thing I'm bound and determined to do. I mean for Susella to have this if you're willing. I took my hands from the dishwater and went through the curtain. Mama, looking thoughtful, was swallowing the last cup of her coffee. She put the cup down, her fingers lingering on the handle as if to give her more time before replying to Cousin Bud's request. Mama, you finished? I asked. She looked around. Yes, baby, you can take it. Bud, you want some more coffee? There might be one more cup left. Cousin Bud shook his head and drained his cup. No, this is fine, he said, handing the cup to me. I took both cups and saucers and returned to the kitchen. As I placed the dishes in the dishpan, Mama gave Cousin Bud her answer. I'll have to speak to David, but if it's all right with him about Susella, it's all right with me. On the way to school, Little Man and I told Stacy and Christopher John about Cousin Bud's conversation with Mama, and that his daughter might be coming. Christopher John speculated as to what this half-white cousin would be like, while Stacy commented sullenly once again that Cousin Bud should never have come. Still discussing the matter, we turned off the first crossroads and followed the curve of the road past the Sims's place. As the road straightened, we saw 2 cars parked up ahead. Doors to both cars stood open, but we saw no one. We kept on walking. Then Stacy halted us with an outstretched arm, waited a moment, and motioned us into the forest. Hidden from the road, we waited anxiously as the sickening sounds of flesh pounding flesh broke the morning silence. Finally, the thudding stopped, and 4 men appeared, got into one of the cars, and left. We waited several more minutes before cautiously slipping back to the road and walking toward the remaining car. Drops of blood splattered in the dust beside the car led us farther down the road into the defile on the left-hand side. There, a man was lying face down. Apprehensively, we looked at each other. Then Stacy turned him over. It was Mr. Farnsworth, the county agent. He dead? Asked Christopher John, his eyes wide as he gazed at the bloody figure. Stacy hesitated, then knelt down and placed his ear against Mr. Farnsworth's chest. His heart still beating. Well, he sure looked dead, observed Little Man. Stacy stood again and stared down at Mr. Farnsworth. We waited for him to decide what we were going to do. Well, one thing, we can't be taking him no place, he said after a look up and down the road. White folks see us and they be thinking colored folks beat him up like this. Be thinking maybe even Papa or Mr. Morrison did it and he die. He can't tell no different. And we go home, it take too long. I looked from Stacy to Mr. Farnsworth. What we gonna do then? Just leave him? No, objected Christopher John. He die sure then, Cassie. Stacy studied Mr. Farnsworth, then checked the road again. No one was coming. Got an idea. Let's get Jeremy. What he gonna do? I questioned, seeing very little sense in bringing him into it. Him being white, he can take him somewhere. Well, what about Mr. Farnsworth? Shouldn't some of us stay with him? Nothing we know to do for him, Cassie. Somebody white come along. We better not be here. Y'all come on with me to get Jeremy. Running, we left Mr. Farnsworth in the defile and headed back down the road and up the steep trail that led to the Sims's farm. At the top of the trail, the land leveled out and newly plowed fields came into view. Fortunately, Jeremy was working at the edge of the field near the trail, busting clumps of dirt with his hoe, and only his younger brothers, Leroy and Ernest, were with him to witness our arrival. What y'all niggas doing up here? Cried Leroy, who was no bigger than a minute and younger than me. Jeremy turned on him with a piercing reprimand, and Leroy grew silent. His hoe still in hand, Jeremy came across the field apologizing for Leroy. Ought to be in school, both him and Ernest, but Pa made 'em stay to help with the fields." Stacy looked around. "Where's your pa?" "He ain't here. Said he had some stuff to do." I looked back toward the trail. "I just bet he did." Stacy let me have one of those disapproving looks of his, then said to Jeremy, "Look here, we was thinking maybe you can help us with something." He waited a moment before going on. "Mr. Farnsworth, he laying out there on the road by his car, all beat up and needing somebody to get him where he can get some help." Jeremy's eyes widened. "Mr. Farnsworth?" "That's right, and we figured it'd be better if you take him somewhere than us." "If you take him somewhere than us." Jeremy thought a moment and frowned. "You know, my pa don't much like him none." "He don't like us neither," I reminded him. "But you don't let that seem to bother you none." "Where you want to take him?" "I figure you could drive him to Mr. Granger's." You mean you want me to drive his car? You can drive, can't you?" Jeremy shook his head. "Didn't get a chance to learn before R.W. and Melvin took the truck up to Jackson." Stacy looked back toward the trail, trying to decide what we should do now. "Well, I know how," he said finally. "Uncle Hammer, he taught me." He turned again to Jeremy. "If I drive him up to Mr. Granger's, will you go get the help?" Jeremy nodded. "Sure thing, but let's not take him to Mr. Granger's. He'll be asking too many questions." "What that matter?" I said. "You don't know the answers." Jeremy still didn't like the idea. "Let's take him over to Mr. Tate Sutton's. He ain't much caring for Mr. Farnsworth none either, but he'll help and won't be asking a whole lot of questions." With the decision made, Jeremy ran back to speak to Leroy and Ernest, and leaving his hoe with the fussing Leroy, ran down the trail with us. "You tell 'em about Mr. Farnsworth?" I asked. "No, just that they better not tell nobody I was gone, or I'd take care of 'em when I get back." When we reached the defile, Mr. Farnsworth was still lying motionless. With all of us helping, we picked him up as carefully as we could and set him in the passenger side of the front seat. Then, with Stacy in the driver's seat and the rest of us in back, Stacy started the car, turned it around, and headed north. At the second crossroads, he turned west, away from Great Bay, and a few minutes down the road stopped in front of the Suttons. Stacy glanced up the drive to the house, set some distance from the road, then at Jeremy. "You ready?" "I guess, but you know, Stacy, I've been thinking, what if we just slide Mr. Farnsworth over so it looks like he come up this far by his own self?" Stacy considered. "That ought to work just as well," he said, obviously feeling that Jeremy had as much right to look out for his own well-being as we did ours. Gently we moved Mr. Farnsworth to the driver's side. Then Stacy, Christopher John, Little Man, and I hurried into the forest on the other side. Once we were securely hidden, Jeremy laid on the horn, blasting the morning silence. Within seconds, Mr. and Mrs. Sutton came hurrying down the trail to investigate. Lying expertly, Jeremy said he had just come along and found Mr. Farnsworth beaten up in his car. As Jeremy had assumed, the Suttons asked no questions. Mrs. Sutton checked Mr. Farnsworth's eyes and told her husband they had to get him to Dr. Crandon's in Strawberry. Mr. Sutton called for one of his grown sons to help him, and placing Mr. Farnsworth once more on the passenger side of the car, he sat at the wheel while his son followed in their pickup. Mrs. Sutton and Jeremy stared after them for a moment before Mrs. Sutton turned and went back to her house, and Jeremy started down the road. Stacy, Christopher John, Little Man, and I walked along the forest edge until we figured we couldn't be seen from the Sutton place, then joined Jeremy and walked as far as the crossroads with him. There, Jeremy turned to go back home, and we went on to Great Bay. School had already begun by the time we got there. That evening, when we told of what had happened, everyone worried about any possible repercussions if Mr. Farnsworth should die, and about our part in getting him the help he needed. Long after the boys and I had been sent to study, we could hear the grown-ups talking in the kitchen, their words muffled behind the closed door. Eventually, we heard the kitchen door to the porch open, and then the sounds of Papa, Uncle Hammer, and Mr. Morrison talking as they headed for the barn. We expected Big Ma, Mama, and Cousin Bud to join us now, but when none of them did, we did the best we could to concentrate on our last week of lessons. Outside it was not yet dark as the winter days gave way to the longer days of spring, and it was raining, the sound of it pelting like a melody on the tin roof. Though the day had been warm, a chill hovered over the evening, and Stacy made a fire. Little Man, not yet allowed to build a fire himself, helped him. For a while, Little Man stood with one small hand placed on Stacy's shoulder as Stacy knelt before the hearth waiting for the fire to catch hold. Then the two came back to the study table. "Looks like we got some mighty studious folks here," Uncle Hammer said, coming in the side door. He smiled as he passed the study table, then stooped and picked up something from the floor. He was about to put it on the table when he noticed that it was the picture of Jeremy. He stared at it, read the words on the back, and set his eyes on me. "This here got your name on it," he said. I felt a sudden nausea. His eyes narrowed. "Now just what you doing with a picture of a white boy?" There was a terrible pounding in my chest. "He gave it to me." "He gave it to you? What for?" Uncle Hammer's voice was calm, quiet, but it terrified me. I had seen him like this before, and I knew that a terrible anger lurked behind the calm. I had always been fearful of that anger ever being directed at me, and now I could only stare up at him, unable to speak. He just gave it to her, Uncle Hammer." I looked over at Stacy, silently thanking him for coming to my rescue. "He gave me one too. Just his way of being friendly. He didn't mean nothing by it." "Didn't mean nothing by it," Uncle Hammer repeated, his voice soft. He turned Jeremy's picture over in his hand and stared at it in silence. Christopher, John, and Little Man looked at me and then back at him, waiting for the explosion to come. "You let a white boy give your sister his picture, and then you sit there and tell me he didn't mean nothing by it?" Stacy glanced nervously at me, then met Uncle Hammer's eyes with a steady gaze. "Well, Uncle Hammer, Jeremy, he just come home from Jackson and was glad to see us, and he had some pictures of himself, that's all. He ain't like most of the white boys round here, and he—" Uncle Hammer held up his right hand and Stacy stopped. I realized that in that one movement, Uncle Hammer was attempting to keep his anger under control. I knew also that in defending me and Jeremy, Stacy had now brought the brunt of Uncle Hammer's displeasure down upon himself. For a time, Uncle Hammer said nothing. We waited. When he spoke again, there was an unleashed anger in his words, anger that stemmed not from us, but from what he now told us. "Stacy, you soon gonna be 14. Now that ain't so very old, but it's old enough to know how things stand. And if you don't know it already, you better start learning right fast how white men think about black women. You seen it just Saturday with them two white boys hanging round that Peters girl. If that girl had been mine, I would have whipped her till she would have been thinking twice before she went sashaying around white boys again. And if her folks don't get her straight soon, it's going to be one sorry mess, 'cause that sort of thing don't ever come to no good. A white man think he can just have his way with colored women, can have them for the taking. I've known him to go to black man's house while that man was in the field working, trying to take care of his family, and that colored woman didn't have no more respect for herself than to take up with him. I've known too of colored women telling their husbands or their daddies or their brothers about white men trying to mess with them, and I've seen their men's folks trying to kill for trying to protect their women. And it's the same up north. They come riding through our neighborhoods in bright daylight, trying to pick up our women folk, and don't care nothing about how they use them. White men like that ain't nothing but dogs as far as I'm concerned, and I'd rather see Cassie dead than take up with one of them. The blood rushed to my head, and the silence which filled the room pounded against my eardrums. I felt sick and wanted to run from the room, but Uncle Hammer wasn't finished. You just look around you and you see how they treat our women. Then you take a look at how they treat their own women. They think every man in the world wants one of their women. And if a colored man even looks sideways at one of them, they start talking about lynching. A colored man caught carrying around a picture of a white girl like Cassie got of this white boy wouldn't be long for this world. Back to business, when I was about 14, there was a boy your papa and me knew who lived over by Smelling's Creek that was messing with a white girl, and a bunch of men come out of his place one night and cut off his privates. That's just how bad it is. He looked at each of us. Now, I know it's hard, but there ain't no easy or pretty way to say it. And the sooner you learn how these things are down here, the easier it's going to be on you. Cassie, you got to always respect yourself and your family and your men folks. And you boys, you got to always respect your own women and take care of your sister. Y'all understand what I'm saying to you? We were too stunned to answer. What'd you say? Yes, sir, Stacy responded, and the rest of us immediately did likewise, though Christopher John Littleman looked to have understood very little but his anger. Uncle Hammer nodded and started across the room. As he did, Mama came in from the kitchen with Cousin Bud behind her. Hammer, I thought I heard you in here, she said. You know, I've been meaning to ask you. She stopped as her glance fell on the boys and me. What is it? Uncle Hammer waved a hand at Cousin Bud. And Lord, whatever y'all do, don't be no fool and go crying after some white woman. Hammer! It's all right, Mary, said Cousin Bud. He faltered. Lord, he's right. Don't you think I know he's right? Then, like a man beaten, he met Uncle Hammer's unrelenting gaze and went back into the kitchen. You shouldn't have done that, Hammer, Mama said, her voice flat, angry. Bud's family. Uncle Hammer glanced toward the dining room door. He may be family, Mary, but that don't keep him from being a fool. Then, turning from her, he crossed to the fireplace, and without hesitation, he threw Jeremy's picture into it. The boys and I watched it burn. And that's the end of chapter 6. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his peace.